Welcome back to the channel, PloopAChoopTV, and if you're new to the channel, welcome to Break the Backlog, the show where I sit down and provide my thoughts, opinions, and personal stories about a particular game that I've been playing. Today we're going to talk about what was probably my most anticipated release of this year, Final Fantasy XVI. A few weeks back I covered the demo, and how it really made me excited to take on this new darker toned take on Final Fantasy. I couldn't wait to pick up where the demo left off and continue the story in Valisthea. Because this is a story-focused game, I'm going to do my best not to spoil any of the story elements that happen outside of the demo or a bit after that, except for showing maybe some of the abilities that you'll unlock throughout the game. That way you guys can go and enjoy this game as well. With all that out of the way, sit back, relax, and enjoy as we break the backlog on Final Fantasy XVI. As I said before, I'm not going to talk too in-depth about the story post-demo, but I will cover what the demo entails to kind of give you an idea of the world of Final Fantasy XVI. So Valisthea is the world that our tale takes place in, and it's no stranger to the scars and trauma of war. Massive magic stones known as the Mother Crystals have provided the world with access to the very magic that they contain. This magic can be used if you actually have a shard of the crystal, which pulls in ether from the world around you and allows you to do things like fill cups with water or light a cigarette, for instance. People who can use this magic without the crystals are known as bearers, and are enslaved and worked hard by those who do not have access to such gifts. These bearers are often worked inhumanely hard and as such will die from a curse that turns them to stone. On the other end of the spectrum exists dominance, people with the ability to command and become icons, powerful godlike beings with immense elemental power who are used like super weapons by their nations to wage war on one another. I talked more in depth about the early portion of the story in my demo first impressions, which will be at the top of the screen here or in the link in the description below. But the main point is that Clive Rossfield, our hero, has been beaten over the head with the bad end of the stick. His kingdom was betrayed and overthrown, his brother murdered before his very eyes, and him being shackled, branded, and forced to fight for the enemy who murdered his father and stole his homeland. When we meet adult Clive, he is simply trying to survive until he can track down the person who murdered his brother, the dominant to the second icon of fire that shouldn't exist, Ifrit. The story here is very dark and gritty, and I think that this was a nice tonal shift for the series. I understand that it's not going to be every Final Fantasy fan or gatekeeper's cup of tea, but as far as my own personal taste goes, I do love grimdark fantasy and I'm here for it. Now, I will say that a lot of the characters in this game and some of the plot points do feel like they're kind of just ripped out of Game of Thrones. For instance, Clive is a lot like Jon Snow. He even has a wolf. So there is some kind of weirdness to that, but overall, I was willing to look past that, and I really did enjoy the darker tone of the story. From the conversations between leaders that reveal bits of lore about the realm and its socio-political working, to the sweet scorch of betrayal, the narrative wears its inspiration on its sleeve proudly. I think that this game, while not a traditional Final Fantasy, did do a good job of taking core concepts from the long-running franchise and transposing them into the world of Valisthea. One of the best examples of this is the massive godlike creatures known as icons that Final Fantasy fans will probably recognize as summons or aeons, etc. from past games in the series. I found it ingenious that these entities were utilized as the nations of Valisthea's nuclear options, and it felt like it made a lot of sense. In a world where war talks, the better your giant Evangelion kaiju flesh suit god thing is, the more intimidation and power you have. I also think that utilizing another classic Final Fantasy concept and the crystals as something to be worshipped like gods is an interesting take on them, as they provided all of the magic in the world. The main cast has quite a few interesting characters with their own motivations and beliefs that are shaped and molded by the world around them, for better or worse. I will say that the removal of a traditional party system with characters who could be controlled and fall in combat, there is a bit of a disconnect here, but overall, their stories and personalities still manage to shine through on many occasions through the storytelling. This also extends to Clive, who is an edgy protagonist but in the best way possible. Seeing the range of emotion that Clive experienced from his deep sadness to raw rage made him become one of my favorite Final Fantasy protagonists of all time. I felt his pain and the deep moments of despair where all seemed lost, and I couldn't help myself from rooting for him to enact his revenge on those around him who had done him wrong. He's lovable, he's badass, and he has a good little doggo. Clive is pretty key. Without giving too much away about the story, I will say that the main story arcs in this game can be absolutely gut-wrenching. Watching the world reveal itself through the narrative, as well as seeing what the bleak and violent nature of this world has done to the main characters, really carries that dark fantasy tone so well. I also think that the payoffs in this game are good, and the story feels like an epic fantasy by the end of everything. There were just so many moments in this game and Clive's journey that I resonated with, and even some that really tore me up inside. Something that I found myself disliking in this game was some of the pacing, just in terms of the falling action after each big story arc. I get you can't have the narrative be 100% action, high octane, high stakes, massive set piece battles all the time, but some of the in-betweens feel like MMO side quests. Sure, they offer interesting bits of lore about the world occasionally, but I found myself slogging through these parts of the story as the narrative nearly came to a grinding halt. We may have just had an epic battle with another icon, but now Clive is sent on a fetch quest to kill bandits that are threatening a town, or gathering parts for a person that wants to build a ship, which involves, you guessed it, killing more basic and elite enemies before some sort of boss fight all over again. This may have just been a me thing, but I felt like when the story slowed down, it slowed down to a crawl at times. Another thing that I just want to touch base on was this video I saw on YouTube by Fun My Life. Shout out to them, link in the description below. Their coverage and research to source this interview was great, and it left me even more excited before release. In this interview, the team who worked on the game said that they were looking to redefine what side quests meant and ensure that they felt important and not just tacked on. I'm just going to say this, the side quests in this game do a great job of adding more to the world and telling us about the people, the places, and the structures of Valisthea. However, many of the ones that I played were just simply fetch quests. I don't know if they were all that groundbreaking in that regard. The side quests I engaged in had me slaying monsters, tracking down lost goods, and delivering items to people. And once again, the dialogue before, during, and after with characters did add some brilliant layering, exposition, and explanation of the world and its denizens. So I guess take that however you want. The side quests that I at least experienced, which wasn't all of them, so I could be wrong, but the side quests that I completed were fetch quests, and they had some nice prose or exposition added to them that essentially was supposed to make me feel like my task of running around delivering soup meant something to these characters. I don't want to say too much more, but just know that most of what is here is fantastically realized. The towns and locales that we visit throughout the world feel like real lived-in places. The lore runs deep and makes good creative use of Final Fantasy concepts that are found within the long-running series as an ode to games before, and the dark tone of this game was a welcome foray into uncharted waters for the series. I thoroughly enjoyed the narrative of this title, and the grand scale of this vengeance-based narrative made me excited to reach each and every next big story arc. I did have some issues with the game's pacing, as I said before, with the game slowing down between large plot points, which left me sprinting through some of these laws as fast as I could get through them, and the side quests may not have been as revolutionary as the team may have wanted them to be, but all things considered, I love the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI, and it made me excited for what direction the team will continue to take the series in. I still remember the cutscenes from Final Fantasy X, and when I was little, I was just awestruck by how beautiful this game was to my little underdeveloped and Game Boy SP scorched retinas. After receiving this game for Christmas and hearing the title theme for the first time as I booted up my PS2, I fell in love with the soundtrack, which would be a theme in the other titles that I played in this series. Ever since then, I have found that two large pillars of what I expect from a Final Fantasy game are beautiful art direction and equally beautiful soundtracks. Luckily for me, Final Fantasy XVI delivers on both of those fronts and is another strong entry in the presentation department with a few hiccups. Starting with the game's visuals, both me and Nadia, who watched me play most of this game, thought that the art style and direction were just well executed and gorgeous. The dark tones of this world are imprinted upon the land, the people, and the architecture in ways that really boost the overall grittier feeling of the narrative. I felt like Clive as our main hero looks pretty sweet, and I loved his outfit changes throughout the story as he grows up in front of us. I also found that the design choices for most of the main cast were unique and interesting, and I don't know how to explain it, but it carried with it a subtle feeling of that Final Fantasy XIV art style that Yoshi P has previously worked on. Cutscenes are beautiful in both appearance and voice acting, with the entirety of the cast giving good performances. The massive icon battle see sparks fly, and at many times throughout the story I felt like my jaw was on the floor at just how beautiful and visceral these fights could be. The world of Valisthea is beautifully morbid, and it's because of the amount of detail applied to the visual style of this game that I feel as though the narrative just had more weight to it. Now, this doesn't mean that it was a complete perfect experience for me. There were some issues with frame drops when I was in the team's base of operations mostly, but for me those were kind of few and far between. Something else I noticed a bit more of was that some of the side characters who are meant to be rather important to the narrative look kind of generic. I don't want to spoil anything, but if you've played through the story, maybe you'll get what I'm saying. I just felt like some of the characters that help Clive throughout his journey seem a bit bland, and because others shine through, this causes the dullness of these other characters to be even more prominent. As for sound, I found the soundtrack in Final Fantasy XVI to be a perfect pairing to the gritty story, and it just increased my enjoyment of the big boss battles and moments of tragedy with its sweeping orchestral pieces that cover all of the highs and lows of Clive's journey. The soundtrack is perfect in my opinion, and it will likely be one that I'll return to when I'm editing or when I just want to enjoy some masterfully crafted video game music. The voice acting was also well done, with the main cast carrying some extremely strong performances. Special shout out to Ben Starr for crushing it as Clive and showing a wide range of emotions that gave our hero conviction and personality. Now, Nadia, on the other hand, didn't like Clive's voice throughout the narrative, as she felt like the vocal performance was a bit over-animated and that it didn't fit adult Clive that well. I could see why she felt this way, but overall, we both thought Clive was pretty cool. All in all, I think that the presentation of Final Fantasy XVI is a wonderful pairing to the narrative, from the perfect soundtrack to the stellar vocal performances. Now we have arrived at what I imagine will be the biggest reason that Final Fantasy fans are split on this game, much like 15 when it was announced, the gameplay. So what can players expect to be doing in Final Fantasy XVI? Well, for starters, Final Fantasy is a more linear game than 15 was, with large explorable zones that open up throughout the story, and they can be visited at the player's discretion unless in an important part of the narrative. This was a choice that I think was for the best, as the linearity focused the player on the narrative, but with the large zones offering ample opportunities to explore, and some open world games just run the risk of being barren wastelands with nothing to do. Overall, I was okay with this game following a more linear path. One of the main points of contention I think people will have with this title will be the combat system, as this game once again is not a turn-based outing for the franchise. I love turn-based RPGs, and I love turn-based Final Fantasy, so I understand why many players might feel like the new action-based systems found in the last two main entries in the series don't represent the franchise that they once held in such high regard. I, on the other hand, found this game's combat to be enjoyable with a few caveats. The combat in Final Fantasy XVI is real-time action combat, where players can string together combos of sword skills and icon abilities to deal damage to opponents. And larger boss fights, there are also some quick-time events which allow for some pretty sick cinematic moments. Stringing together combos which each of the icon's abilities and sword skills became a cool trial-and-error system of trying to see what attacks maximize damage or just look cool. So yeah, the combat here is pretty fun, though I will say there were some aspects of it that I didn't like. My main complaint is that there were times when I felt like I was just on autopilot, and sometimes, to be honest, I was a little bored while I was just mindlessly slaying my way through armies of unimportant foes to carve a path to the next part of the story. It was by no means how I felt most of the playthrough, but there were times where I felt like I was really just going through the motions for the sake of the narrative. This is especially true when I was fighting the beefed up, stronger base enemies that the game throws at you just to keep it interesting, that I refer to as elites. These are more capable enemies of this type who may survive being staggered once or twice before they fall. Also, now that I recently started playing the stellar Final Fantasy VII Remake on stream, I found myself wishing that the team would have decided to utilize a system similar to that game, in which the player can swap between characters while in combat. Torgal, Clive's wolf companion, is a companion that can be slightly controlled, though he doesn't offer all that much in the ways of effective damage, even when he's upgraded. Don't get me wrong, Torgal is still an amazing companion, and I loved his inclusion in this game, as it gave Clive a trusty good doggo that stuck by his side no matter what, but Torgal's fighting abilities left a lot to be desired. As for beefing up Clive, leveling doesn't allow us to change his base stats, but it does give us points that we can use on a sphere grid-like leveling system to gain access to more sword skills, stronger magic, and more icon skills. Every skill can be upgraded and mastered for full effect, and I found this system to be a good choice for making Clive feel stronger throughout the narrative, while also not punishing players for their curiosity and allowing us to undo any upgrade for a full refund of points. Clive also has access to accessories and armor that can help players manipulate his base stats, which can be bought or crafted throughout the game. Speaking of crafting and buying, I did find that Gil was basically useless in this game, and I only ever use it to buy potions and other consumables. You receive a massive amount of money in this game, and I just never had enough things to buy with it. Though you can buy songs from the soundtrack for quite a bit of Gil to play on Clive's jukebox, so that's one way to use it, I guess. As for the crafting, I was glad that I could make all of my weapons, armor, and accessories with treasures from my travels, but not being able to reinforce or upgrade the many legendary weapons that you make after finishing important story moments meant I felt like I was switching swords every hour, rather than keeping the one whose design I really liked. Overall, I felt like this mechanic was underused, as it just felt like I was constantly swapping weapons or armor for the next best thing when there were some sword designs that I genuinely thought were really cool. This game is also extremely easy, even on the highest option available for your first playthrough. Sure, I did die throughout the game a few times, but I never felt hopeless or like I couldn't beat a boss. In fact, reviving during a boss fight revives Clive at a checkpoint with a full stock of his potions and an enemy not at full health. This game is not very challenging, which for me was fine, but if you enjoy some level of challenge in your game, this may turn you off. Now keep in mind, I haven't played the Final Fantasy difficulty yet, which opens up after unlocking New Game Plus, and many other YouTubers have said that this difficulty does change the entire game, so maybe I'll report back after I take a break from this game for a little bit and try this out in a few months. So while not perfect, I never expected this game to be, or any game for that matter, I still had an immense amount of fun with this title, and by the end of the story, I was happy with what I had experienced, and I'm looking forward to returning to play New Game Plus eventually and take on the new challenge. Final Fantasy XVI is a title that once again divided a fan base, though it seems less divisive than the series' last numbered outing. Many have found this as a great entry point for the long-running and understandably daunting franchise. From what I played, this game at its core is a fun action RPG with a combat system that only dragged at some points, a beautifully voiced, directed, and performed game with visuals and a soundtrack to back it up, and at its core, a masterfully crafted story that had its moments of raw emotion, dark trauma, epic encounters, and amazing revenge payoffs, with a few pacing issues along the way. The pros far outweigh the cons in my opinion, and I walked away from this game having enjoyed the storytelling and watching this cast grow and take on new enemies and challenges throughout the story. I would highly recommend Final Fantasy XVI to anyone who's on the fence about the game, and just know that it's a wonderful time. I found myself really impressed with the scale of this game. So, there are my thoughts on the highly anticipated Final Fantasy XVI. It's a fun new direction for the game, and while it does have some issues, I still found the experience to be enjoyable. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe, as these are all ways to support the channel and the content we make. Let me know what your thoughts are about Final Fantasy XVI in the comments below, or maybe suggest a game you want me to review. And until next time, peace.